All right, so today we're going to be looking at the philosophical changes in the colonies. And we kind of want to go back to what we were talking about last week, where, you have Columbus who, again, quote unquote, discovers the Americas, but, not really. But what he does usher in is this age of exploration that once Columbus, comes across these brand new continents, well, that was brand new to really a lot of the Europeans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the English all of a sudden decide, you know what, we too are going to start, sending over people to really sort of colonize, cultivate the land, take over the people, so on and so forth. And it really isn't until the early 1600s that the English get their first permanent and successful settlement with Jamestown, Virginia. Once they discover tobacco, they realize this is a cash crop. It's going to make people a whole bunch of money. All of a sudden, it looks like this experiment is actually going to work out. And really, for like the next 160 years or so, things are going great. The colonies are growing. You get those 13 original colonies that are going to form. The English continue to, send people over. Everything's sort of going great. But then by like the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, things kind of start to change. The colonies are a little bit frustrated with the British, particularly the King of England. They're not necessarily happy being like the little stepsister where they sort of have to do what they're told and whatnot. And they really start to kind of question whether or not being a colony rather than being their own country is really going to kind of start to work out. And really, this period that's really going to influence a lot of our founding fathers, those who helped write the Constitution, those who helped form the government that we know today, is going to be the Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment period, was a cultural movement of intellectuals in 18th century Europe and the United States, whose purpose was to reform society and advance knowledge through reason and through logic. So when we're talking about the 18th century, we're looking at the 1700s. So like we are currently in the 21st century and we're looking at the year 2000. But really prior to the Enlightenment, there was a huge focus on religion, and that's really what controlled people's lives. You lived by the Bible, you lived for the Bible, what God told you to do is what you followed, and you really followed the Bible to a T. Like you went to church every Sunday. If you weren't at church, you basically were going to hell. You were this horrible person. Like things were just going to be awful for you and your family, and you were going to bring shame to them because you didn't do something as simple as show up to church. Now today that doesn't really happen. I would say more people tend to be faith-based than necessarily religious. Church attendance in the United States and around the world is down. But a lot of people will say they believe in God and they might go to church like at Christmas time or Easter time. But in terms of like going every Sunday, that is down worldwide. And like I said, before the Enlightenment period, people really focused on the Bible, looking to the Bible for teachings, what's right and wrong and so on and so forth. And with the Enlightenment period, they were kind of like, what if there's a different way? What if we didn't necessarily look to the Bible and the story of Noah's Ark and, what St. Anthony was doing and all these different things? What if we said we just focused on logic and sort of reason? If people are being treated badly, maybe we should just be nice to them. Not because of what the Bible says, because that's just common sense. Little things like that. And so for them, they were like, religion doesn't necessarily make so much sense anymore. Not that it's a bad thing, it's got a place in life, but maybe government should be separate from religion. Maybe government should just focus on logic and reason. It's kind of like why we have a stop sign. Why do you have, stop signs at four-way intersections? It's because if not, people are going to get into accidents all the time. That's logic. That's common sense. And that's really kind of the reasoning that a lot of these founding fathers were started focusing on and looking at in that Enlightenment period is let's focus on common sense and logic to sort of rule our lives rather than focusing on religion. And so because of that, you have a lot of Enlightenment thinkers that really kind of start to come to light. They start making their ideas known. They start publishing them in pamphlets and books and all these different things. These then get distributed to people to read. People read them, and they start to get ideas. And like I said, a lot of those ideas are going to influence the founding fathers, especially when they start to form the Constitution. So one of the first founding fathers that we're going to look at is John Locke, and he said humans are all born free and equal with three natural rights: life, liberty, and property. So when we say that humans are all born free and equal, it means that automatically when they are born, they should be like a human being. And human beings should be able to live their life without fear of being persecuted, without fear of being thrown in jail, without fear of being told by the government what it is they should and should not do. And so when he talks about these natural rights, he's basically saying anybody, no matter what country they come from, religion, their race, their sexuality, whatever it may be, they should all be born automatically with these three natural rights. When we're talking about life, it's just the ability to be able to live your life. So if you want to go and be a teacher, you should be able to do that. If you want to take a vacation next week and head to Hawaii, you should be able to do that. If you want to quit your job tomorrow and start your own business, you should be able to do that. Everybody should have the right to live their life. If you want to listen to music on your way home, do it. You want to listen to a podcast, go ahead. You want to go home and put up your feet and have an ice cream bar. That's how you should live your life. That is your right. When we're talking about liberty, we're really talking about freedom, the freedom to be able to make choices. Maybe it's the liberty to decide what kind of job you want to do in the future. When you look at some communist countries, they were kind of telling people based on their abilities, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to work in a factory, you're going to be a lawyer, even if you didn't necessarily want to be those things. And Locke was kind of like, people should have choices. They should have freedoms. Freedoms are really important. We should also have freedoms like maybe freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Again, not being told what it is we should and should not do and what it is we should and should not believe in. We should all have those choices. And then his last right that he said all humans should have no matter what is the right to property. So today property might look like the ability to own a car, the ability to own a home, the ability to own land, the ability to own your own cell phone, or your ability to own, something in your home, whatever that might look like. And John Locke is really important because his ideas about, these humans are all born free and equal and these natural rights go on to influence Thomas Jefferson when he writes the Declaration of Independence. But he makes a little bit of a twist on it. He says that we are all born free and with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, just meaning that you should be able to live your life however it is that you want to live it. Of course, there's going to be rules in place. No matter what you do in life, there's going to be rules. Like, obviously, you can't go around murdering people. Not exactly great. But you should be able to pursue your happiness no matter what you may be doing in life. Our next philosopher is going to be Voltaire, and there's a couple of things that he had advocated for. He says, man's rights to freedom of religion and speech must be protected. Oi? Something the British, the French, sometimes even Canadians will say oi as well. And then, of course, one of his famous quotes says, I may not agree with a thing you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So really what Voltaire had advocated for was freedom of speech as well as freedom of religion. Now, some of you guys may remember this or have heard about it, but back in 2017, there was an NFL football player by the name of Colin Kaepernick, and he had played for the San Francisco 49ers. And before the start of every NFL game, the national anthem is always played. They always bring somebody out to sing it. Typically, you get a flyover or people who are waving an American flag in the middle of the field, whatever it might look like for each NFL team. And before the start of one of these games, Colin Kaepernick basically decided to go ahead and take a knee during the national anthem. And this caused a huge uproar. He was interviewed after the game. People were like, why did you do this? And he basically said that not all Americans are treated free, especially Americans of color. We're dealing with police brutality. We're dealing with discrimination. And I'm essentially not going to stand for the Pledge of, not the Pledge of Allegiance, but the Star-Spangled Banner and the national anthem until this is officially dealt with. Well, everybody across the country had an opinion. Some people were for it, some people were against it, some people were like, well, that's his right, whatever it may be. And one of the people who was very famously interviewed about this was Jim Harbaugh. He's the current coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, but back in 2017, he was the head coach over at the University of Michigan. And people were like, that's your former player, that's your, the guy that you coach. What do you think about what he did? What's your opinion? And Harbaugh really doesn't necessarily give an opinion. He actually just quotes Voltaire and says, I may not agree with a thing you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And he's like, what I think personally doesn't matter. He's got the right to freedom of speech. He can do whatever it is that he wants with it. So freedom of speech, as we know, is protected in the Constitution. Something else that's protected in the Constitution is the freedom of religion. So if you want to be Christian, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, Wiccan, you want to believe in a God, you want to believe in no God whatsoever, you think something might be up there, up in the universe, but you're not entirely sure what it is, Under the Constitution, that right is protected. And part of the reason those rights were protected was because they were influenced by none other than Voltaire. You have Montesquieu, who's really kind of focusing on the structure of government. And he said power should not be held by one man alone, but separated amongst several branches. Power should be a check to power. And really what he was worried about is power being in the hands of one person and one person alone. And this was something that the colonists were dealing with. They were under the rule of the British monarchy, and King George III was in charge. And they didn't necessarily like all the decisions that King George III was making. He was kind of telling the colonists what to do. Taxation without representation, we know, is going to be kind of a big thing that sort of people focus on. And they were like, why can't we make our own decisions? Why can't the people have a say in our government? And those are kind of the things that Montesquieu added for. If one person's in charge, whether it's a monarchy, a dictatorship, whatever it could be, it's probably not going to be the best form of government. Because if one person is deciding things for everybody, eventually you're going to get people that are unhappy with their decisions, and more than likely it's going to lead to some type of rebellion or even an abuse of power. You can look like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Those people, for the most part, medically, they're destroyed. They're starving to death half the time. They have no clue what the outside world, besides what's going on in North Korea, looks like. And in a lot of ways, it really is an abuse of power. And so Montesquieu is really advocating for we should have a separation of power, which is why we currently have our three branches of government. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. So the legislative branch, that is Congress. In total, there are 435 members. 535 members, 435 members for the House of Representatives and 100 members for the Senate. They are the ones that write bills. That's their job, and hopefully turn them into law. The executive branch, that is the president. It is basically their job to enforce the laws. They also are to sign the bills that the legislative branch creates and, again, sign them into law and enforce those laws. You then have the judicial branch, which is basically the Supreme Court. It's their job to review the laws, to decide whether or not a law is constitutional, meaning the law is good, or unconstitutional, meaning the law is bad. So here's how that separation of powers works, or that check to power. Let's just say that Congress passed a law that says anybody with red hair can't go swimming after 5 p.m. And they pass it. And then the president decides, okay, I'm going to sign that too. And says, okay, not a problem. Then the Supreme Court or the judicial branch would review that law, and they would say, hey, that law is kind of discriminatory. It's unconstitutional. We're not going to allow it. So that's why you have that check to power, is to make sure that laws aren't getting out of hand or that power isn't getting out of hand. Because, again, you don't want to live in a dictatorship, because that wouldn't necessarily be a great way to live. Rousseau really kind of talked about how man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. He says the sovereignty of the people is essential to the creation of a just government. Really what he's talking about is for the people, by the people. That in order for government to truly work, in order for people to really want to believe in the process, it has to be created by the people themselves. If the people don't buy into the system isn't going to be sustainable. It's only going to last for so long. A great example to kind of compare that to is like elementary school. When you guys were in elementary school, you probably remember that your teacher had some type of a system in place where if you were being bad, you got like a red circle or like a red star or whatever. But if you were being good, you got a green one. And if you got a green one, it meant that you were like an awesome human. But if you got like a red star and like a phone call home, you just thought your life was ruined, that you were going to get in so much trouble and everything was awful. And as a kid, you really bought into that system. But as juniors now, if I were to try to sell that system to you, more than likely you would look at me, you would laugh and be like, she's being ridiculous, because you no longer buy into the system. It works when you're a kid because you buy into it, but at some point you kind of mature out of that system. And if I try to implement a system like that now with you guys, you would laugh in my face, and there's absolutely no way you would ever abide by it, because it's not for you and it's not created by the people. But if you kind of have a system that works for both parties involved, including government and the people, your government's going to survive over a longer period of time. Even today in the United States, we have elections every 2 years. I know people focus on the presidential election, but next year in November, we are going to have an election, and it's going to be, for our new governor and other positions in the state as well, propositions, different things like that. So it's important that people vote in order to have their say in the government, because again, if they don't have a say, more than likely, they're not going to believe in it. You have Becerra, who said that just because you have been accused of a crime does not mean you shouldn't be treated humanely. Torture should never be used, and you should have a speedy trial, and your punishment should fit the crime. So really what Sarah is really sort of looking at here is the rights of the criminally accused. How do we make sure that those people who have been accused of a crime are still being treated fairly? That was kind of the ultimate goal. So again, just because you have been accused of a crime doesn't necessarily mean A, you're guilty of it, or B, that you should be treated inhumanely. So again, let's just say I was arrested today, and I was arrested because they think I murdered somebody. They can't just throw me in jail and not give me any food and water. It doesn't work like that. I have a right to a phone call. I have the right to consult an attorney. I have a right to see what evidence it is that the cops have. And if they don't have any evidence, guess what? They can't hold me in jail. I get to go free. That's part of my rights. It's how I make sure that, again, I'm being treated fairly. It also says that torture should never be used. So again, you can't necessarily, waterboard someone to get them to give you information. You have a right to remain silent and not incriminate yourself. But also, if you're not guilty, people just can't torture you, right? It doesn't work that way. You have the right to a speedy trial. So if I get accused of a crime, they can't wait 10 years to put me on trial. I get a right to a trial within 45 days. Now, I can waive that right, and a lot of people do because it kind of gives their lawyers more time to, learn about their case or whatever it may be. But if I said, no, I don't want to excuse my right to a speedy trial within 45 days, I get the right to go to trial, and I get a trial by my peers. And then, of course, the punishment should fit the crime. If I was accused of stealing a candy bar, cutting off my arm would not be a fair punishment. If I was accused of murder and they decided to put me in prison for the next 25 years, that totally makes sense. But that was really what Becerra was looking for, is making sure that those who were accused of crimes, that they were still treated fairly. And again, even if they weren't necessarily guilty or they were innocent, that they still have some rights that were necessary towards them. Wollstonecraft, she says, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? Women are treated very differently now than they were even a couple of 100 years ago. Back then, women were not allowed to own property. Women were not allowed to hold a job. It was very much a stereotypical role for women, where the expectation was that women were going to cook, they were going to clean, and they were basically going to take care of children. And Wollstonecraft really kind of red flagged that of that doesn't really seem fair. We talk about how all people are born equal, that we all have the same exact rights. But if men are allowed to have a job, if men are allowed to participate in politics, and if men are allowed to own property, if men are allowed to have money, why isn't that women are getting the exact same treatment? We're equal, right? So shouldn't we get the exact same things? But that's not what was happening. Women were not being treated equally. They were really being treated as a doormat, where the expectation was, again, they would be a housewife who would cook and clean and take care of the kids. And of course, she's going to go on to, influence people like Abigail Adams. As the Constitution was being written, she was writing her husband saying, hey, don't forget about the women. The women too need to be treated equally. And we know that's going to take women, time before they get to be able to vote and whatnot. Women don't officially get the right to vote until 1920. Of course, white men had been able to vote long before then. All men, no matter the race, will get that right in 1870. So it takes women a really long time to sort of get that right. But you had people like Wollstonecraft who never stopped fighting, I should say, for women to be able to get those same rights. And our last philosopher that we're going to look at is Adam Smith. He said, if humans freely follow their own self-interest, government will be guided by an invisible hand. And this is laissez-faire. And laissez-faire just means hands off. And what really Adam Smith was looking about and talking about was the economy. And he was like, listen, the less rules that government has, the more likely people are going to be innovative and be able to create things. If people are able to be innovative and create things, they're going to create more businesses. If there's more businesses, people are making more money. If people are making more money, they're going to be a lot happier. So again, you can kind of look at compared to a communist country compared to a capitalist country. Under communist rule, pretty much all the money goes in one pot, and then it gets divvied out by the government. And it's up to the government how those different things get divvied out. And Adam Smith was like, those people aren't happy. If you're a doctor and you are you pick up trash for a living, I'm not saying that both those things aren't important, but someone who's a doctor should probably make more money than somebody who picks up trash for a living. He's like, but that's not what's happening. Instead, they're making the exact same thing. And it's going to lead to people becoming resentful, and it's going to lead to people really not wanting to be innovative or creative. So he's like, the less government can kind of butt into people's lives, the more likely they're going to be able to create good things. Like if the government had a rule that says, hey, we can't make any more cell phones, that means whatever cell phone that you have, that's going to be the last cell phone that you ever have. And we know that cell phones only last so long. That would be too heavy of a burden, too heavy a restriction, and the economy is never going to grow. Companies rely on creating no phones and getting you to be like, hey, my iPhone 13, it's kind of old, but now I see this iPhone 16 or 17 coming out, and I want the latest and the greatest. So therefore, I'm going to trade it in and upgrade my phone. You count on that. Businesses count on that because, again, they want to be able to make money and provide you a product, and you want to be happy buying that product. But if the government said tomorrow, we're not making any more cell phones, it's going to create problems down the line. Again, people's phones are going to die. There's only going to be so much stock that's going to end up being left. And then eventually, cell phones would no longer exist. And Adam Smith was like, those are bad rules. So the less that government can stay out of people's business, the better off it was going to be for the economy and for innovation.